Senior Analyst at MKG Consulting, Adrien Lanotte will now provide us with his insights into the new normal as regards management in the industry. Please put your hands together.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to see you all here. Well, I'm going to be picking up where that inspirational presentation left off. But I'm not going to go all the way back to hunter-gatherers and cave painting. I'm going to remind you, basically, very briefly, what we see the future is as hotel operators. Remember COVID? Remember the new normal that was made much of? It was a world of masks, where transactions and operations are very different to what had been known thus hitherto. And what's important now is to understand what we see, what emerges from that. Now, change is different as a customer journeys. The first thing prior to the journey, of course, what pops into our mind is a booking. So what's the new normal? Well, just look at this. If you look at the 4 digital platforms, you can see them here, the icons on the right. In France, they've sold altogether 31% bedrooms in 2022 as opposed to 2019. Across the hotel industry, we're down 6.4% volume-wise for hotel bedrooms. Now, we're not alone in this in France. In France, this is something that we can see not only in France, but also in across Europe, plus 23 in Belgium, but it's slightly more muted across the board in Europe. We're on average at plus 7%. Why? Well, it's less true in Germany, for example. You might think it's because it's more the business market, so you have less this leisure and pleasure clientele effect that are going to be using these channels. But it's also true for Spain, where we're pretty flat, really, as the prior, in terms of the pre-COVID period, in terms of making bookings over the digital platforms. There's a regulatory dimension to this, but I don't have time to expand on that. Let's move on. So another point here, hotel operators and everybody involved in hospitality, you yourselves, obviously, primarily so. One thing that has changed before the stay, if you will, is the increase in the presence of these digital players. This is what we saw last year, in fact, if you remember. This links into the financial values. Now, all 4 of these big heavy hitters, Booking, Expedia, Cetri, and Airbnb, those 4, they weigh 200 billion on the stock markets. So that's huge. This is what we showed you last year, if you remember. The good news, silver lining, if you will, with the latest trends, macroeconomic and the stock market dynamics. You will have all seen that or heard about this correction, if you will, in the tech values of stock values. So in hospitality, they're on a par pretty much with these direct competitors. And that's how it is. So that's from the financial perspective. What's of interest, really, is that this has a direct impact upon your prospects and the market underlying that hotel operators work in. Now, if we look at the last 10 years, what's happened? We had these digital players that have turned up on the market. They're seeking supply increase, and they've captured a significant chunk of the market. For them today, the situation has changed. Their shareholders want them to be profitable. They hand out dividends and what have you in cash, and so the tap is on. The tap is turned on, if you will, to bring support to the sizable volume of these digital players. That has shrunk slightly, which means that they themselves also have to generate profits, increase commissions or commission rates, and get extra profit. This is something that you need to bear in mind because you have had virulent competition from these platforms. I mean, they've been very important in terms of their impact on the market. Their growth, however, is also shrinking, which means that this has an impact on pricing power. We saw that with what Mr. Mr. Vangelis said. Prices are up 20% compared with 2019. This is part of the new fundamentals. But we're also in a backdrop where competition is less intense than in the previous period. Now, looking at bookings, what's of interest here? Now, you may have seen pretty much everywhere, you may have seen that things are becoming stagnant with future bookings in terms of price. Okay, let's put that in its proper context. That's what we heard in our introduction to our event. We had this shockwave, we had this rebound, euphoric, if you will, and now we're back into a back to normal period. Now, everything is negative. Just look at prospects in terms of future bookings. If you hark back to the French side of things once again, what do we see? We see until the end of the year, France has been a bit of a pioneer in this. That's why it's interesting to look at it. Markets were a bit later, like in the Benelux, getting up and running again. But France is in the vanguard of what's going on in Europe. So if we just look at between now and the end of the year, the level of bookings is now ahead of the game as what we saw last year. And last year, as we know, was a good year. And then, of course, questions are dangling about behaviors changing because of inflation, where people are booking more ahead of time to protect themselves against future price rises. But the dynamic is pretty positive. So we're seeing a stagnation because of the price, but we can see that volumes, at least, are being maintained. We can also see a rebalancing, a readjusting. Do you remember, over 3 years or so, all the way through to 2021, things were a bit slow picking up, and now it's euphoria. You would have seen that in the major capitals, Paris, London, what have you. And we're seeing this in the future dynamics here, particular in September. We're very much ahead of last year, which is a bumper year. On the contrary, however, we do see that there are some areas that have benefited from this exiting COVID period. In the English Channel, Atlantic had fabulous performance last year and previous years, and now they're stagnating, a rebalancing, if you like, in line with what we normally see in terms of performance.
So that's for bookings, and it's not the only element that has changed. The first point that is important and that is integrated in your hotel transactions is to begin conversation with the consumer before their stay. It began with the chatbots. Now we have a lot of live chats on your mobile sites, etc. You'll be able to exchange with the guests before the booking, and before the stay, use the preferential channels of the client. It will depend on the markets. Here it is WhatsApp and Messenger. In China, it is WeChat and Kakao in Korea. And they will discuss and exchange with the guest so that he can experience the stay before he arrives at the hotel. And that is something that is now sustainable. So this has begun since a while now. From the hotels, choose your room specifically, be able to dialogue with the booking people, say that I want this type of a pillow, this type of a meal. There is all kinds of inspiration in hospitality. We are looking at what's happening elsewhere also. In transportation, we're going to help the guest so that he can build his and construct his trip in a more integrated way. And you will have the section, you'll have the airlines that will propose to book different types of options during your trip, and you will have videos. And you have something that is becoming an important value, an important brick, and that is synchronization between the various bricks of the creation of services. So you have all the software solutions, the new descriptive element, which is AI. AI has a lot of new applications that will come and enrich the way in which we carry out hotel operations. The management, planning, housekeeping, analyzing upstream what the customer feels, HR management, sales sales, etc. An interesting example is to see what Expedia did. They are experimenting synchronization with ChatGPT so that it can become a virtual assistant that will accompany the client while he does his booking. And now that we've said that, of course, we shouldn't be too excessive. That's one of the central messages. Setting up an interpersonal relationship, that is one of the fundamentals in our business. That is how we will enrich our experience on the site. On the site, we have spoken about all the changes that have taken place in digitalization of the consumer journey. We've done a series in hospitality on. If you haven't looked at it, do have a look. And so there's NFC versus QR code, what are the advantages, etc. Now, what you must remember is that you have new modes of addressing the guests, the sales, etc. They have all arrived, and a greater use of the digital for the menus, for the check-in, etc. But now, where does the real change lie? It lies in the staff, the people. You all in this sector have experienced this situation where there is a shortage of labor. But the situation was not very favorable in hospitality to begin with, but now it's got worse. And the consequence of this difficulty to find staff, is the evolution, the change in personnel costs. If you look in the fourth quarter of 2022, the unitary labor cost, if you took all the payrolls in hospitality in France, it is plus 11% compared to what we had in 2019. So we have an annual growth, whether it's in hospitality or in F&B, which is 3.5–4%. Some of you, I hear you think, and you feel, yeah, it's much more than what we had in the previous decades, and we were used to that before. And one could believe, well, yes, our dear institutional trade union representatives have signed an agreement. It had been a long time. We hadn't done it, and we had to update. We did it once. We're not going to begin again right now. But this increase in labor costs, this is cross-sectorial, and it is global. If you look at what's happening in the various regions of the world, if you look at the unit cost of labor, whether it's in Europe, in France, or in the US, you have increases of plus 5% per year. So strong increases, and unfortunately the situation is not solved, and it will still be a very important topic in the future. The other change this leads to is that you are the business models, and I think that we can all be happy about that. The business models are changing. If you look at the breakdown in the declarations before hiring the person, the people with whom you're going to sign a contract during a given period of time, for several quarters now, after the COVID, the standard contracts are increasing. Permanent contracts in France, permanent contracts where we went from 185,000 in the fourth quarter of 2019 to 220,000 over the same period in 2022, so plus 20% increase. And what's interesting is that it is a greater loyalty of these resources, of these employees, and also of the people who would intervene in a recurrent way, the extras. This really developed in the years 2000, and now finally all the contract signatures, short contracts, well, these people, we're trying to make them stay a bit longer with longer contracts, longer term contracts. So that is for human resources. Now, another driver that has really changed during the operations, these are the energy costs. Now, what are we talking about? The energy costs in a hotel in France before the COVID, on an average, it was between 3 and 5% of the total sales. Today, we're talking about 1.5%. That is, we've gone from 3 to 4.5%, 4.5 to 5% in the hotels in France on an average. And it is greater in Germany, for example, where there was a greater effect of this energy shock. But in Spain, it was the reverse. In Spain, you have the prices that have really increased. steeply, and they continued along their path in terms of energy prices, and they are at the same level as in 2019. So it is creating gaps between the markets in terms of their competitiveness in hospitality in Europe. And this increase in energy prices, this should lead us to think about how can we be more efficient. And with the data from the Adrien, we can look at the impact when you have a hotel that is heated with gas, electricity, or through the urban heating system. A hotel that uses gas instead of electricity, in terms of crude energy, I suppose you've all looked at all that with all the CSR issues from the tertiary decree. When you go from gas to electricity, a hotel will consume 18% less. If we relate that to the urban heating network, the hotels consume 44% less. It's not just a question of going from one to the other. It's all the people who've made that choice. Those people have a more responsible approach. But the energy consumption topic is very interesting because it leads to certain opportunities in the operations, and it's important in terms of real estate. If you look at the energy consumption of hotel buildings in France, and if you look at the time of construction, the period of construction of the hotels, that is very important in terms of their performance. So there is a generation of hotels that is distinct from the others. Those are the ones built in the 80s. The first chain hotels built, the energy consumption of the building was twice as much as the recent ones, 2010, etc. Here again, there is a potential for operational optimization, and we can create more value also. One of the major changes, one of the elements of the new normal, is to take into account social and environmental responsibility. That's ESG, all the classical elements, water, waste, energy that we discussed, but we also have holistic approaches. We're talking about all the procurement operations, personnel, societal engagement. All these elements are being worked upon by the industry so as to improve the CSR approach. And one element that has really changed and that has become once again central in the operations, and we had this discussion when we imagined our agenda, well, F&B is part of hospitality. It's not something we need to deal with separately. And F&B is at the heart of hospitality. But what are we talking about? F&B, even in Escoffier's country, well, that isn't what we imagine at all. Fast food is half of the activity, the investment, whatever metric we use, half of the business of F&B in France. In France, the country of traditional F&B, and that's fast food. And you have the dark kitchens, carryaways, and the frontiers have blurred. So now you have operators, and the leader, the number one on the market here, that is the Bertrand Group, that's going to operate brasseries and fast foods at the same time. So the frontiers have fallen as operators, and the traditional operators are thinking differently. During the COVID session, we were wondering how to deal with the premises. Well, we have to find for new F&B concepts, not always have the same thing to meet the needs of customers who stay overnight. We're going to look at what's interesting on the micro markets. We took an example with a Pullman here that took the help of an Italian company, and now Italy, out of the 17,000 Parisian restaurants, it's 1/5. So if you want to deal with those guests in a local market, you have French traditional offers, brasseries, crêperies, etc. But you have this type of restaurants also. And this will vary according to the markets. If you take Berlin, for example, Berlin, you will have a different breakdown of the market structure in F&B. And that's something that hospitality people have to look at. Now, the real topic is, well, F&B is an important topic. We are talking about it, we are addressing this topic. Now, how can we deploy concepts, new concepts? Because this is a business where we have to look for scale economies. Another problem we have is that there are certain consumption consumption habits in terms of cuisine, but also operational opening times, operation, how does it work? Well, it depends on the markets. It varies. And within the markets, too, in Paris, for example, half of the F&B offer, the restaurants are closed on Sundays, and they're also closed on Mondays. Now, if you look in Europe compared to France, there can be new opportunities. The all-day openings in large French restaurants that is not really developed. You have different situations in Germany because of their life rhythm, and the Spanish hours, everybody knows about that, and that is well illustrated here. So that's for F&B. That has become a very crucial point that we need to take into account in hospitality today. But the other element that has changed is to take into account our experience. What are these experiences? Well, there is blurring of the borders. We've seen it in F&B and in the experience. You have Paris Society that will do traditional hospitality, catering, clubbing, events, and it works in the other way around. You have Equinox. It's a fitness chain in New York, and they've launched hotels. So the permeability of the market goes in both directions, and the hospitality universe has enlarged itself to other environments, and other players are entering into the sector. And there's a breeding ground to look for these different businesses. This is translated differently according to different players on the market. In Asia, we have the Crayon and the Penta Hotel in Asia. They have launched their private club, like the British clubs in the 19th century. And you have spas, well-being, etc. Now, closer to us, we have players, the franchise, like Lavarel, and they will have their own boats. So, river boating, tourism, they'll have their own chateaus. And this illustrates the convergence between the universes, the fact that the hospitality universe has to look for other types of experience. Then in health, you have at Nerano and Sana, and we will try to see what we retain from all this. Well, operations have really changed, but if we look at what's happening elsewhere, maybe there are other ideas we can look for. What do we see in other universes? There are a lot of elements, subscription, different installments, remote consulting, looking for other businesses. So this gives us an indication on a new future from the operational point of view in hospitality. These are third players who are going to look for new business models. For example, players in betting, they're going to say, well, instead of asking clients to pay, it will be invoiced per overnight stay to the guests. And you have other offers with services contracts, with maintenance, so that everything might be managed externally and you don't close any rooms when you need them. So a lot of new business models. And what is cross-sectorial here? Well, the hotel managers have to look for expertise wherever it is. And for that, you need partnerships. This is what you see with Dorchester that went to look for Koyo for their shoes, Hyatt that took the help of Spotify, etc. And here you see you have a technical university that has partnered also. So these are change engines in our operations. And last but not least, and here this is the brilliant, connected to the brilliant presentation by Olivier. So since the COVID, we've had changes in our lifestyle habits, a lot more remote working. So this accounts for 38% of the employees in France for 2 days per week. So what does that mean? I don't know if you remember, those of you who were here among our loyal customers when we had this event in 2020 in presence, we had shown you this slide that was showing the gap between the performance, the RevPAR, during the summer period compared to the rest of the year. And we were saying, well, leisure, this could be a recovery driver. And this is exactly what we've observed. And we see this after the COVID. If you look in Spain, Madrid and Barcelona, we had seen that Barcelona was far more exposed to leisure. And this is what we have today with the outperformance of this destination versus Madrid or Berlin compared to Munich and Düsseldorf. So this escalation of leisure is changing. It's changing the operational balance. There are the destinations that have good performance, those that have resources, and those that need additional development. And this induces a balance between the weekdays and the weekends. If you look at the RevPAR during the first 6 months, it has changed by 10% during the weekdays in France versus 30% during the weekends. This is something we see in the business markets like Germany. What's interesting is to see it's not so much so in Spain. Why? Because they have different trade models. There are more resorts, and so they have more business during the week, and that is something we have to think about to capitalize on this increase in business people versus leisure. And if we look at the overall view of all this, well, you hospitality people, you are fighting for more leisure time available. That was Olivier's message. We are in competition on this available leisure time that has developed, and that's good news because it's not just exceptional revenge travel. This is structural, and this rationale should underpin your operational and strategic reflections. And if you take it under that angle, we, hospitality sector, as presented, we're defending the values of social leisure time and give meaning, give moments of exchange between these players. Your competitors could be Netflix, Nintendo, if you work things out this way. And you might wonder, how can I capture this available leisure time? Thank you.